So the idea for this service actually came up sometime last year when I came across a story about the show MASH. Now, I grew up watching MASH from a very young age, but when I watched it as an adult, I realized kind of how sexist it was, especially in the early years. A lot of the stories, or at least scenes, kind of revolved around men objectifying women, and it's kind of cringeworthy in those early shows. And so I wasn't surprised to read this story last year about Loretta Swit. She tells how she told, I don't know when this interview was, it was a few years back, where, they would be doing table reads of those early episodes, and she would come up with ideas for her character, and she said the producers would just kind of routinely dismiss them, and just like, it's like she didn't even speak. And in one case, she came up with an idea, and, they just sort of moved on. And then a fellow actor, McLean Stevenson, repeated her idea. And the producer said, "That's a great idea." And McLean, bless his soul, said, "Well, then why didn't you think so when Loretta said it 10 minutes ago?" Right? Now, the funny thing about this story is, this is 50 years ago. This is 50 years ago. And so it's kind of easy to dismiss and said, well, things have changed since then. Yeah, maybe not. I think about, I attended a panel discussion last fall with 5 high-level executives, 3 men and 2 women. And these are all, C-level type folks, true meeting of equals. And I noticed throughout the discussion that the men really dominated the conversation. They tended to kind of hold forth while the women kind of waited for an opportunity to speak. Now, the moderator, I knew she knew what was going on, and she did her best to try to, create those openings, but it was a tough assignment. And now, I don't think the men were doing this on purpose. They weren't being aggressive in any way. But the net result was sort of the silencing of women. Now, Rebecca Solnit, we heard the reading from, she's written about this extensively. And she argues that these social dynamics are not petty matters. This isn't just about people being impolite or acting crude. She says, this is of vital importance. Who is heard and who is not defines the status quo. By defining whose voice is valued, we define our society and its values. Now, I think it's easy to recognize and condemn sexism that stems from that kind of willful ignorance or malicious intent. We had the Me Too movement, which was vitally important. But there's also a kind of sexism that I think is more subtle, and it's a sexism that stems from what I would call cultural programming. And I know I've been complicit in this myself. As I've mentioned before, I did an internship. After I did my internship here, I did it at the hospital, Sibley Hospital. And I was part of a cohort of intern chaplains that was a mix of race, gender, age. And I filled the role of the older white male. No doubt about it. That was my place. Now, so every week we met as a group with our supervisor to talk about our experiences. And early on, I noticed that my fellow chaplains, my fellow interns, tended to, not want to speak up first. They tended to hold back. And, this wasn't surprising because this is very difficult work. It was very humbling work, and so we all felt a little vulnerable. But I felt comfortable talking, about that, speaking out of vulnerability. And so I figured, well, I'll break the ice. I'll break the ice and, just to get over that discomfort. But then my supervisor actually brought this up in one of our one-on-one meetings. And she didn't think it was a coincidence that I, the old white male, was often the first to speak. Because while our society has evolved a lot over 50 years, people tend to still defer to the older white male. I realized that I had taken this for granted. Of course I'm comfortable speaking first. I've been doing it all my life. right? Or most of my adult life. It's very insidious. But Solnit argues that the silencing of women tends to be part of what she calls that larger inequality of voice, an inequality that allocates more credibility, audibility, and consequence to some people than to others. Inequality of voice, and those others include children, elderly people, people living in poverty, and of course, immigrants. So here's what I want us to think about. What are we missing out on? I think about those conversations we had with my interns. You know, I'm sure the insights I shared were perfectly fine, you know, and valuable. And my colleagues would eventually speak. But I also wonder what might have been said some days if I hadn't spoken first. You know, would someone have shared something that they hadn't shared otherwise? Would they have shared something that we could have reflected on and learned from? You know, what kind of wisdom might have emerged? And I remember watching my supervisor guide these conversations. She was very good at kind of seeing who was talking and who was not, and if someone was holding back, you know, she would call them into the conversation. And sometimes someone would start to share something and then sort of pull back. You know, again, there's that vulnerability. And our supervisor would say, "Tell me more. Tell me more." And that's the phrase that really interests me. You know, it's a very interesting phrase. You know, on the one hand, it sounds like a directive, right? You know, tell me more. But really, it's an invitation with a kind of an implied question mark. Tell me more? And the best part is, it's wide open. When she's saying, tell me more, she's not dictating what you say. You know, she wasn't saying, tell me what you felt, or tell me what you did next. She would just say, tell me more, and let the person decide what direction the conversation needed to go. Tell me more. This is the antidote to the inequality of voice. So, for example, I wonder what we might hear if we listened to the voice of immigrants. Think about all the images from Minneapolis. Think about the violence we've seen. So we see that. We know how horrible that is. But what do we know about the daily experiences of people living in fear? Fear of assault, fear of deportation. What do we know about their experience of being scared to leave their homes, to shop, to go to work, to go to school? And what do we know about the experiences of people in detention centers? Of people who have been torn from their families, who have lost their livelihoods, who may lose their lives? What stories would we hear if they were not afraid to speak? You know, I think we're headed for a national reckoning. Someday we are going to hear their stories, and it will be a source of national shame. But if we heard their voices now, if we understood their experiences, how might their stories reshape our national dialogue, take us in a different direction? You know, let's be real. This is why some people speak about empathy as a sin. Because when we open ourselves to understanding the experiences of others, it might change us. It might change us. We need to hear those voices because we need to be changed. That's what the Me Too movement was all about, right? Those stories had to be told for things to begin to change. And we can't stop there. We've got to say, tell me more. This is the work we must undertake in the years ahead as a faith tradition and as a nation. We need to make sure that we make room for all voices to be heard. We need to hear the stories and experiences and the insights of people from all walks of life. We need to see what wisdom might emerge. Tell me more. And you know, there are a lot of people looking to ensure that voices stay silent. Think about the efforts underway to whitewash our national parks and our museums. Think about the way they're removing signs and exhibits that highlight discrimination and violence against people of color, against women, against the LGBTQ community, and of course, against immigrants. Tell me more. We need to hear those voices because we need to change our cultural programming. We need to hear those voices because we need to wake up. We need to wake up to our shortcomings. We need to wake up to our misunderstandings, and we need to wake up to our ignorance. We need to recognize that we are not as enlightened as we might think, that we've made less progress than we might assume. Now, I realize this sounds like a bit much and that there's not much that we can do as individuals or as a congregation, but I don't think that's the case. Because here is what we can do. As individuals, we can wake up like mystics. We can wake up to the diversity of people in our midst. We can create space for others, for each other, to share their stories, to share their heartbreaks, their fears, and their dreams. And we can see what wisdom might emerge. We need to wake up because only then can we grow into the beloved community that we all long for. We can grow into the beloved community that we want to be. Tell me more. We need to listen. We need to wake up, and we need to be woke. May it be so. Amen.